They sent me one of those, it's an Echo Dot. I actually am quite worried about it because I think it taps into you.
Trust is a vital element of human life and of society. But is there a crisis in trust? Surveys from across the globe show that trust in organisations, in government and in technologies is declining. Governments, businesses, technology companies and research engineers are investing millions of dollars in trying to win trust back from publics, from citizens, and to design trustworthy technologies. Concerns about trust then are going across all of these different sectors. Technology, self-driving cars, artificial intelligence, governments, public institutions, media.
Automation is not for me.
We will not allow for remote control unless it is imposed by government.
For organisations committed to sustainable futures, trust is a vital asset. Without trust, people won't participate in the digital and net zero transitions that are planned for Australian society. Are we facing a trustless future? Trust in self-driving cars is low. What research shows is that actually people feel that they can trust in certain situations when they're with self-driving cars, but they're not in other situations. And if trust is about familiarity and feeling comfortable, how do we generate those feelings?
We want to understand how it works and have the insight into how decisions are being made through technology, because it feels like it's by technology.
What can we do to ensure that future Australian life is sustained by trust? In Futures Hub, we're developing a new approach to trusted futures.
People have continually less trust in institutions, and yet trust is being symbolized in some contexts through this thousands and thousands of years old institutional symbolism.
The first step is to move away from dominant transactional perceptions of trust as a commodity, which can be won, earned, gained or lost. Does trust really feel like the firm grip of a white male corporate handshake?
The symbol of the handshake with a man in a suit, whereas that might have created trust a decade or two ago, I think it actually has the opposite effect today, because the world is changing. And if we think about creating futures that are just and equally distributed for all, then we want to get away from that imagery. Having a little bit of playfulness or queering it a little bit. And I think that's a good thing, because we want to see diversity also in that handshake. We want to see different hands. If that is what we see in the handshake, well then we trust that this is a future that includes us.
Trust is the feeling we experience when we have confidence in our circumstances, in people, in technologies and in the environment.
I was happy then that I had messaged my sister. It made me feel anxious to step out of my comfort zone.
When we trust that our friends will support us, our smartphones won't run out of power. It's not the technologies we trust, but the situations that they're used in. And everyday moments of trust can be riddled with uncertainties.
You know, as a woman taking a ride share somewhere, there's always this lurking at the back of your mind. Can I trust in this situation? Can I trust in this driver?
It's the situations in which we use smartphones that we can't trust, not the smartphones themselves.
If a rideshare company was able to say, we have autonomous cars, which is also giving you as our customer some level of autonomy. So would there be somewhere to override if the car was taking you somewhere or the driver was taking you somewhere, but you could actually have a say?
And there's also an interesting question around whether rideshare companies would want their passengers to be in an entirely autonomous vehicle.
So how can we start again to create the trusted futures that will sustain our transitions to inclusive and sustainable emerging technologies and to net zero transitions.
There needs to be trust in the transition, also in digital technologies that are both posing a lot of challenges to the environment, but are also part of solutions.
And maybe the social sciences need to change their approach to engaging with engineering and science disciplines and how they approach questions around trust.
So please join us in this new chapter of trust research and work with us to create and imagine trusted futures.